as largely negative before it was applied to people of African or Asian ancestry. Dr. Akbar, the prominent African-American psychologist, often talks about one of our issues is that we have become, we meaning people of the African world, the continent, more especially the diaspora, so-called black folks, are very reactive rather than proactive, which means that if this individual is calling himself white, we're going to react and call ourselves black. It's the opposite. Not really understanding that we're not exactly taking a step in the right direction, because now, as I like to say, given all the linguistic and cultural baggage of black, you are trying to push an elephant uphill on roller skates. You're trying to turn a negative into a positive when there's a clean, pure stream.
If you're referring to complexion, in fact, there's this scene in the movie Cry Freely about the life of Steve Biko. The presumption is that this event actually occurred. If it didn't, it still made sense in terms of the screenwriters and Richard Attenborough putting it into the film. And that is, Steve Biko was in court. He's charged with basically, being seen as a threat to the apartheid system, and he was banned. So he's in court talking to the European judge, the board British judge, and the judge says to him,
"Why are yourselves black? I mean, you people are more brown than black."
And Biko says,
"Why do you call yourselves white? You people are more pink than white."
And the judge goes,
"Precisely.
But there's no deeper unpacking of what just occurred." And it raises an important question about systems of oppression. Why did Europeans decide to designate themselves as white? More specifically, English-speaking Europeans, because the term white is an English term. When you know why they chose the term, then you know what they sought to gain by it. When you also see that they leveled the term black against us, Asiatics, Africans, Asians.
When we see Pleiadian ships, we see a sphere of it, because the Merkaba are moving so fast. The Atlanteans will say.
Then you know what they sought to gain by imposing that on us. But why the need to fixate on black? There's the work of a Harvard psychologist who I believe is of East Indian ancestry. Her name is Dr. Benashi. And her work on looking at the implicit association test, which is used by psychologists to look at implied bias or biases that exist. She recognizes what are often called mind bugs, or she keeps on the term mind bugs, which are culturally imposed perceptions of reality. And the dominant perception of reality for those of us who speak the English language is when you say black or use black, its dominant use is negative. Black magic, black night, black death, right? And to try to overcome that is very difficult. Now, this is a Harvard faculty member, psychologist, prominent psychologist, who's pointing this out, and she calls them the mind bugs. Now, part of what people do, you could say, well, you need to get people to stop thinking of black as something negative. Okay, that's all right, but in the context of, do you want to fight that battle, or more importantly, should you be fighting that battle? Because you're still reducing yourself again to your pigment, and you're not looking at yourself in the context of a larger history. And if you want to, like I said, if you want to speak of we as highly melanated people, or we as NUC, or we as I would say, people of predominant African ancestry, that makes more sense to me. I'm just saying. So when I looked at what Drew Ali was trying to convey, and did convey, obviously those who heard what he was saying, back in the early teens and 1920s in particular, that you are not black, you are not Negro, you are not colored. Just on a psychological level, I can see the value. I haven't even gotten into what the value and importance of what he was saying by having folks reject calling themselves Negro, black, or colored, because that's a whole nother issue. I just got into the psychology of it, right? That's why people, confuse. I've often thought of this. You have a child reading about the Black Knight and the Black Death and the Black Plague, and then the child goes, "Oh, and I'm a black child." What Benaji and others, Eric Heyman, and another social psychologist who's talked about this issue of implicit bias and its roots not in the individual mind. Part of the perspective on this is many psychologists are now trying to figure out why is it that police tend to shoot quote-unquote black men at the rates that they do. And is it because the individual police officer is overtly racist? And what some of this psychology is now suggesting is it may not be a sense of overt racism, but rather the culturally imposed racism. People used to call national character, how nations see themselves as a result of their particular histories and experiences. So, like I said, Drew Ali, just in terms of saying you're not Negro, black, and colored, was getting people out from under that weight of the negativity associated with blackness. And people say, well, it's better. The same person would not allow you to call him a Negro. But with all due respect, Negro is the same thing as black. If I'm speaking Spanish, I'm going to say Negro. I'm going to call you Negro, right? So it doesn't make any sense. Yet, again, more is a reference to a people, to an empire that covered a geographical location. Moorish Empire at one time was
Running 5G, and it's rolling out as we speak. Instead of trying to beat it,
from the northwestern part of the Maghreb or North Africa, all the way down to the Senegal River, and as far east as the border of Egypt. That's part of what I'm just talking about. What we know is the recognized Moorish Empire in terms of international diplomatic history and relations. So we can say that covers a wide swath of the African continent. That would include Africans of various hues. People who would be darker in complexion and others who would be lighter in complexion. And the primary sources from Duarte Portuguese travelers and Azrara and English sources all affirm that the term Moor was used for people of African ancestry. Later, the term blackamoor introduced, but it's part of the development of the kind of pigmentocracy direction that exists. Within the English language, just as in other languages, there are different ways to translate something more accurately. So, and one of the examples I've often used is the difference in Spanish. If you're speaking of knowing someone versus knowing something, you don't use the same verb. Conocer and saber is not the same thing, right? One means to know a person, one means to know about something. By the same token, if you translate more to simply mean black, knowing that black in the English language is affiliated with so much negativity, long before it was ever referenced for people of African, or I dare say Indian ancestry, because a lot of people seem to be under the impression that black was only used to refer to people of Africa, and that's not true. Black was, and in some cases, is still used to refer to people of Asia by Europeans. My first trip to England, and I was talking to people from Indonesia and Pakistan and Cambodia and different parts of Southeast Asia, and they were bringing to my attention how you can read articles in the paper, and this is in the early 90s, where they would talk about a black person doing something, usually it might have been affiliated with some criminal act, unfortunately, which was part of their point at the time. But they were saying that the term was used to encompass them. And there was a debate between the younger generation of these people from Southeast Asia, saying, well, we'll use the word black. I mean, people in the Americas have a black pride movement, and, you know, there was black consciousness in South Africa. And then there were those who were elders who were averse to it. They didn't like it because they said, you don't want to be encapsulated simply in a color, because now the emphasis is simply on your color and not on your culture. So they said, well, they saw the value of, meaning other people saw the value of trying to use a new hip kind of term. But the elders said no, because what that's doing is reducing your value, because in the English language, black is largely associated with a bunch of negativity. And just like Richard B. Moore said in his book from the 60s, the term or the word Negro, its origin and evil use, he made the same argument. Why you shouldn't use the term Negro? Well, guess what? Negro is Spanish for black. So folks went from Negro in Espanol to black in English. But it's still the same thing. And I literally mean thing. So defining yourself by an ethnicity or a nationality clearly would make more sense. When the late, great political scientist Ali Mazrui, who was known for doing a series back in the 80s on Africa, he was Kenyan born. He actually said black people are the only group in the United States that is designated racially as opposed to geographically, right? Or nationally. And this is part of the problem, right? You have, and that's why I've said to people all the time, why don't we speak as yellow Americans, right? If we're going to use the color nomenclature, use it across the board. Just use it all the time. But someone will say, well, I'm Irish, I'm German, black, and they're running through their lineage. And I'm like, all right, Germans come from Germany, the Irish come from Ireland. Black, what is that? At least, well, I don't, because we don't know where we're from. You can at least say Africa. At least say Africa, right? At least say African. I know I was mapping answer. And now, in this day and age, you can even do an Ancestry.com test, and they can tell you, right, what part of Africa, what ethnic group or nation or so-called tribe one is from, right? So the value of not identifying with black is it compels you to be more specific in identifying culture, knowing your geographic origin, knowing your history.
Okay. And that's my main argument. And I've been arguing this for over a decade, and people, I don't know, when it comes to the race issue and they say, oh, you guys always want to take it back to slavery. Yes, 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 we do. That was our inception in this country. Okay, so that's where once again, the so-called black man or African American story begins. That's not the African story, but here, and what happened to the African descendants in America is the worst ever. And people act like they cannot acknowledge that. Oh, the Irish were treated like fucking slaves. They say the Irish are the niggers of Europe and this and that. I don't give a fuck what, who. Oh, the Japanese were in internment camps. The Jews are always persecuted. I don't give a fuck about any of that shit. At least you know who you are. And that's the main thing. Everybody knows who they are. Except the so-called African American, yo. We don't know who we are. At least your last name denotes the nation that you're from. If you're O'Malley or if you're a goddamn Jinhua or wherever the fuck you from, yo, your name denotes your nation. And I just did an interview with somebody. Her last name is Yerkonis. I'm like, what is that? She's like, it's Slovakian. My husband's from, it's a Slovak name. And that's it. Like, you can hear it, and it's like, wow, that's weird. Where part of the world is that from? And just from your name, people should be able to establish a region. Oh, I'm Irish, I'm Polish, I'm German, I'm Russian. My family's actually from Norway. You know, the African American can't say that shit because of what happened to us, of what they did to us. They beat that shit the fuck out of us. And we have no real memory of that shit. And that Ancestry.com bullshit, man, that shit has very, very, very low percentages of giving you a precise answer of where your genetic stock comes from, because we've been diluted with so many other fucking races throughout the fucking centuries, yeah. And it's ridiculous, and I feel upset every time I think about that. You know, my last name don't mean shit to me. Honestly, it's a European last name. That shit don't really mean nothing to me.
To memorize everything from this chapter. You can click on the link in the description below and download the study notes for this chapter for free. Using the exact notes from this video will definitely elevate your own studies. Also, be sure to subscribe to Alexa and hit the notification bell for more videos and resources just like this one. We'll see you in the next video. Peace and love.
So this whole thing about, well, it was the bad South and the good North when it came to slavery.
And I'm asking you to look at these laws because these laws will help you understand what slavery was about. What we have here is we know the white slave owners will be raping the black women. But their kids are not going to be free. Let's make that clear right here, right now. We're going to steal their God from them, but even if they accept our God, they're still slaves. When you look at that one, I think about policing in America today, it sends chills up and down my spine. And look at what you can get executed for. Growing your own food, learning to read, and assembling in groups. I remember talking to my great-grandmother, who was born to parents that were slaves. And I remember her saying, we had to be very careful not to show how smart we really were, because a smart black person was a threat. So, can I see a show of hands? How many people in here know about the Colonial Marines? I see about 4 hands go up. And I'm not suggesting, I'm not trying to embarrass anybody. I'm trying to make the point that our history has been stolen from us. The Colonial Marines were black slaves that fought with the British in the War of 1812. And do you know why they fought for the British? Because the British told them, if we win, you get your freedom. And when people are fighting for their freedom, they can be vicious. And the Colonial Marines were vicious. They knew all the back trails because they had been slaves in the South. They knew where you could cross the rivers. And so they were a great assistance to the British in fighting the Americans. And they were part of the troop that drove the Americans back into Washington, D.C. and set the White House on fire. About 3 months later, Francis Scott Key, who was part of that American group that got driven back to Washington, D.C., is now in Baltimore at Fort McHenry, and he's watching the bombs bursting in air and getting excited and getting motivated to write the national anthem. And one of the things that Francis Scott Key wrote about was, you know, these black Colonial Marines, they're of concern because what if all of them did that? So here is the end of the 3rd verse of our national anthem, written by Francis Scott Key. Refuge could save the hireling and slave from the terror of flight and the gloom of the grave, and the star-spangled banner triumph doth wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave. That is your national anthem, our national anthem. And my point is that from Plymouth Rock, white supremacy was the basis of how this country was formed. It doesn't mean that we're not a great country. It doesn't mean that we currently are all bigots. It means this is the truth about how our country was formed, and we can either deal with it realistically and as the truth, or we can keep trying to deny it. And in terms of keep trying to deny the nature of our true history, I feel like just saying, how's that working out for us? I'm now going to show you, in the words of the people who built the country, how important white supremacy was. Important as the soul is to the body, and without it no house can gain a proper stability. And you're like, Jeff, that's 1784, a long time ago. Bear with me. 40 of the 56 signers of the Declaration of Independence owned other human beings. the founding fathers of America had absolutely, positively no problem with white supremacy. They believed in it. It was the truth. It was the reality of their time. And they weren't embarrassed to say it. One of the main reasons that Native Americans were driven off their ancestral land. The plantation owners had to have room. If you're going to grow cotton and tobacco, you need a lot of land. 13% of the entire American population was enslaved by 1860. Can I see a show of hands? How many people understood that slavery was that pervasive? And maybe some, and that's good, but you know what? I guarantee if you knew that, you didn't learn it in high school, and you didn't learn it in college. You learned that somewhere else. This is not taught to us. To understand the economic dependency on slavery. And so when I talk about monuments and the Civil War and the things that are behind this, one of the other things I would just encourage you to do, like any other investigation that you would do, follow the money. To understand what the motivation is, just follow the money. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 took 100,000 adults and sent them on our version of the Long March. And you see how many of them died on that march. What this did to the Choctaw Indians in the Southeast was horrendous. And here's why they did it. Because they needed room for this. People may think, well, I have an understanding that slavery was somehow directly tied to cotton production, and cotton production was kind of important. I want to ask you to think about that in some different terms. And before we do that, let's talk about Andrew Jackson, who was the architect of the Indian Removal Act. And our president, once again, we talk about rewriting history. You can't diss Andrew Jackson. He's on the $20 bill. And if he's on the $20 bill and he's a horrible, horrible person, what does that mean? Does that mean we have to take him off the $20 bill? Does that mean we have to start thinking about why we put him there in the first place? I don't want to deal with that. He's a great president. Well, these are the facts about Andrew Jackson that I'd ask you to consider. And that third one especially. And I want to give you a little bit more detail about that. But here's what our President of the United States has said about Andrew Jackson. And I'm going to read this. Had Andrew Jackson been a little bit later, he wouldn't have had the Civil War. He was a very tough person, but he had a big heart. And he was really angry that he saw what was happening with regard to the Civil War. He said there's no reason for this. The problem with it is, the first problem, that Andrew Jackson was dead 16 years before the Civil War started. And I know it is. It's like, are you kidding me? But it's like as funny as a heart attack. Because there are people who believe this. And this is part, you're saying like, oh, it's ridiculous, nobody believes that. We are in 2017 and we're having a debate about what the Civil War meant. If you think that who controls the past is not important, you are wrong. Think about the arguments that we're having in this country today, and it's because the past has been concealed. This is one of the most amazing books you will ever see, written in 1839, Slavery as It Is. And the only thing these people did was to go to newspapers, cut out articles about slavery, and put them in a book. That's why they called it Slavery as It Is. And so I want to show you the real Andrew Jackson, because he had a slave that ran away, and he wasn't having that. So he put an ad in the newspaper. stop the runaway, and he offered a $50 reward. That's not what I want to talk to you about. It's the end of this newspaper advertisement put in by Andrew Jackson near Nashville, state of Tennessee. And this is what it says. If you find that slave, $10 extra for every 100 lashes any person will give him, to the amount of 300. When people say folks didn't fight the Civil War about slavery, they were about defending slavery. This is years before the Civil War. This is slavery as it is. Everyone knew that this is what slavery was about. There weren't any questions about it. I offer you these laws to get you once again to think about what slavery actually meant, and especially the law from Oregon, which I don't have the adjectives for it. So, Texas school officials are saying we want our children to learn that slavery was a side issue to the Civil War because it's divisive. We have to look forward. And President Trump is saying we need to love each other now and whatever. But we need to love each other and we have to look forward, not backward. And I get that. Looking forward is important. But if you are looking forward for a place that is false, then where you're looking forward to is the road to hell. We can't go forward without acknowledging where we have been. What these people have forgotten is the story of King Cotton. And that's something that I will never forget. I didn't have to learn this in the past 6 years. I had to learn the true meaning, but I didn't have to learn the term. Because King Cotton was part of my upbringing in Memphis, Tennessee. King Cotton was a food brand. King Cotton was on everything. There was actually a hotel, King Cotton, in Memphis. Army and Navy Club, completely air conditioned. Bed and halls sprinkler protected. 3-channel radio and Muzak, and overlooking the Mississippi River. This was one of the luxury hotels in Memphis. But what does the phrase King Cotton mean? What it meant to me was bacon. Because King Cotton bacon, King Cotton sausage, King Cotton like rolls. This was like the food of my childhood. Everybody in Memphis bought King Cotton brand. And when I finally found out what the name actually stood for, I felt like I wanted to throw up. Because King Cotton theory that was used by Southerners before Civil War to say, we can do this. We can break away from the North and it's economically feasible. And here's why. Everybody depends on our cotton. We can shut down the mills in the North in a heartbeat. Britain and France are going to have to make a decision. Will they support us militarily? Because we can cut down their mills. We just won't send them our cotton. It couldn't have been more practically and beautifully stated than it was by Senator Henry Hammond of South Carolina. Without firing a gun, without drawing a sword, should they make war on us, we bring the whole world to our feet. What would happen if no cotton was furnished for 3 years? England would take her headlong and carry the whole civilized world with her, save the South. No, you dare not make war on cotton. No power on earth dares to make war upon it, because cotton is king. Follow the money. This is how important cotton was. What kind of money are we talking about? 1840, cotton made 59% of all U.S. exports. This is 15 years before the Civil War. 1.5 million pounds with about 700,000 slaves, and you can see how that managed. 2.25 billion pounds and almost 4 million slaves. This is what made made America wealthy. This was the formation of wealth. And folks, I just want to make sure as a side note to say, I hope you don't think that the money made from slavery just dissolved and went up into the air. It went into companies and businesses. And not even tracing and blaming those corporations. Those corporations hired people and paid their salary and their benefits and gave them the ability to raise families and to pass wealth on through the generations. This money is what made America financially stable. The market value of slaves in 1860 was greater than the market value of every railroad, factory, and bank combined. Follow the money, because the money we're talking about was huge. Think about the role of slaves and trade and slave labor in the economy. And that's a statistic that shocks me. Because Mississippi Valley today is one of the poorest places in America. And in 1860, more millionaires per capita than any other place in the country. And that was because of slavery. The white plantation owners did not have the capital to hire hundreds of workers to work these gigantic cotton plantations. They had to have free labor. And if there is any doubt about it, and let me just say, there's absolutely nothing wrong with retail jobs. But when you have an economy that is based exclusively on the exploitation of free labor, this is what happens. We are now 150 years later. There is no industry in the South that has replaced the slave trade and what could be worked on by slaves. The mayor of New York City recommended that New York, not the state, the city, withdraw from the Union during the Civil War. Why was that? If you go and read, it's because we are making so much money from slavery, we want to keep doing it. If we withdraw, we can then be friends with the North and we can be friends with the South. They are saying it to you as plainly and as directly as they can. And so the people today who say the folks honored in these monuments were not fighting for slavery, my response is, I understand that that's what you want to believe. And I understand how difficult it is to wrap your mind around the fact that human beings, fellow Americans, would fight, kill other people, and die to preserve slavery. It's really hard to wrap your mind around that. But that is the ugly truth. If you read that quote from Abraham Lincoln, I was raised to understand that Abraham Lincoln was my savior. I was taught that Abraham Lincoln freed the slaves because he knew that slavery was an abomination. Abraham Lincoln said on many occasions, if I preserve the Union and keep slavery, I'd do it. If getting rid of slavery is what it takes to preserve the Union, I'll do that too. What his goal was to preserve the Union. And I just want you to know that the debate about reparations for slavery is a completely false debate. First of all, go back to 1988 when Ronald Reagan was in office. Passed with almost no dissent was a bill giving $20,000 to every Japanese American family that was interned during World War II. That was absolutely appropriate. $20,000 doesn't even begin to compensate those families for what was taken from them, for what they lost, and for being essentially imprisoned for the term of World War II. At least it was some acknowledgement that what we did was wrong. You talk about reparations for slavery, $20,000 for 4 years of internment. What is it for 256 years of slavery? And here is the kicker. Reparations were already paid, because in the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln set aside $1 million for DC slave owners to be compensated for loss of property. This is our history. We've already talked about the Indian Removal Act. In the middle of the Civil War, the government still was doing what white supremacy demands, which is favoring the white class over everyone else. And I'll give you a perspective on this that's interesting.
At the very same time that America refused to give the Negro any land, through an act of Congress, our government was giving away millions of acres of land in the West and the Midwest, which meant that it was willing to undergird its white peasants from Europe with an economic floor. But not only did they give the land, they built land-grant colleges with government money to teach them how to farm. Not only that, they provided county agents to further their expertise in farming. Not only that, they provided low interest rates in order that they could mechanize their farms. Not only that, today many of these people are receiving millions of dollars in federal subsidies not to farm, and they are the very people telling the black man that he ought to lift himself by his own bootstraps. This is what we are faced with, and this is the reality. Now, when we come to Washington in this campaign, we are coming to get our check.
This is not the Martin Luther King that they pull out on MLK Day or for Black History Month. So, what was the Civil War and the Confederate flag really about? And as opposed to listening to people, one of the things you can read is this phrase, read about is a phrase called the lost cause. And that's a suggestion that it wasn't really slavery, it was states' rights. Did we hear that from Ronald Reagan's advisors? That's what it was all about. And I have no complaint with that. It was about states' rights. It was about the right to own other human beings as slaves. It was about culture, and the culture was white supremacy. It was about those things that the people who say the monuments should stay up, it was about the things that they say it's about. It's just that their history is causing them to see heritage and culture in a way that is completely false. So I have an idea. If to know why the southern states left the Union and why they started the Civil War, why don't you just ask them? South Carolina, the election of a man to the high office of President of the United States whose opinions and purposes are hostile to slavery. Mississippi, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest of the world. A blow at slavery is a blow at commerce and civilization. They are telling you as clearly as they can, our entire economy is built on slavery, and if you take that away from us, we're going to end up with nothing but retail jobs. Louisiana, the people of the slaveholding states are bound together by the same necessity and determination to preserve African slavery. Alabama declared that the election of Lincoln cannot be regarded otherwise than a solemn declaration on the part of a great majority of the northern people of hostility to the South, her property, and her institutions. Her property were the human beings that they owned, And the institution was the institution of white supremacy and slavery. They are telling you as plainly as they can, and my question is, why are we so unwilling to listen? Why are we so unwilling to believe exactly what they're telling us? This is my favorite. All white men are, and of right ought to be, entitled to equal civil and political rights. That the servitude of the African race, as it existing in the states, is mutually beneficial to both bond and free, and is abundantly authorized and justified by the experience of mankind and the revealed will of the Almighty Creator. Do you think that they stopped believing this because war was over? They are telling you as clearly as they can. At the South, and with our people, of course, slavery is the element of all value, and the destruction of that destroys all that is property. This is why we are willing to send our fathers and brothers and sons to make war on the North to try and separate our country. Because if we don't, you're taking away our very lifeblood. We need these slaves, and we are comfortable with it, and we thought you were too. And finally, let me just go back a second. The Confederate battle flag, and maybe many people know this, it went through several iterations. The first flag was essentially all white, and it had what you see up here as a little thing in the corner. And then it went through several different iterations, but they all were the same thing. And if you want to go to the person who would have the best read on what the flag meant, how about the person who created the flag? And what he had to say was, as a people, we are fighting to maintain the heaven-ordained supremacy of the white man over the inferior or colored race. If we ain't fighting to keep slavery, then what the hell are we fighting for? There is no question about what the Civil War was about. And there is no question about the monuments to that war, because every person that is lionized in those monuments may have been brave, they may have been strong, they may have done incredible acts of courage on the battlefield, they killed other people, and maybe they gave their own lives, and they did it so that they could own other human beings like chattel. Why isn't there a statue of Heinrich Himmler in Germany? Why isn't there a statue of a Nazi soldier in Germany just saying, hey, he was just fighting for his country? They have figured out something that we haven't. And one of the reasons is they have dealt honestly with their past. So, these monuments, this publication is put out by the Southern Poverty Law Center. I would encourage you to get it. You can get it online. It has amazing information about the monuments that have been erected in America and where they are and when they were put up. So where are these monuments? Well, I think a map is probably the best way to show it. That's half the country, and that's the other half. Those are the top 10 states with the most monuments. And here are some facts that come from their study. About 1,503 monuments, and they're still counting. They haven't gotten them all. 109 public schools, 80 counties, 9 official Confederate holidays, and 10 United States military bases. You imagine that, a United States of America military base housing U.S. soldiers that is named for a person whose glory came from being a traitor to the United States and killing U.S. soldiers. Why don't we have Osama bin Laden at the World Trade Center? That's the distribution in terms of Confederate states, border states, Union states, and then not a state during the Civil War. You can see where these monuments were built. And so if we're asking the question, why were these monuments built? One of the things that we want as we're thinking about the answer is, well, where were they built? Were they built in the North? Were they built in the West? Why were they only built in the South? And then we have this question, when were these monuments built? There were two spikes between the end of the 1800s and about 1921, and then essentially during the Civil Rights Movement. These monuments weren't built right after the Civil War. These monuments weren't built by people who were directly related to and lived with the people that died in the war. These monuments were built by folks who never knew the men that they were lionizing. (1900 to 1921). You see there, and you won't be able to see the date, but it's 1896. That's Plessy versus Ferguson. And the thing about that is, what I'd like people just to think about when I talk about how white supremacy is so ingrained in American culture that we don't even recognize it anymore. Plessy versus Ferguson was more than 30 years after the Civil War. And I told you the South may have lost the war, but they won the peace. Plessy versus Ferguson said the concept of white supremacy, it's not just the social construct anymore. It is the law of the United States, handed down by the highest court in the land. There is no other way to think about separate but equal. We weren't good enough to be in the same places as the white folks were. And you'll see later that Thurgood Marshall, when he argued Brown versus Board in front of the U.S. Supreme Court, part of his argument was this: separate versus equal was a concept that was derived to try and keep former slaves as close to that state as was humanly possible. Plessy versus Ferguson, the law of the United States. A 7-1 decision. And so now we're talking about, so there's a spike in these monuments being built. What else was going on at the exact same time in America? Well, this is one of the things that was happening. The fact that this was normal, the fact that this was behavior that didn't really shock anybody, tells you something about how deeply white supremacy has been ingrained into American culture. Several years ago, I heard people on TV saying, this was one of the greatest movies ever made in the history of American film. And look at the advertisement, a stupendous motion picture employing the services of 18,000 people, accompanied by a symphony orchestra of 40. Film and art does give you an idea of where a country is and what a culture values. And this was one of the greatest hits of American culture at the time. How great? Well, it was 3 years in production. And many people don't know that this was the first movie that was ever filmed in the White House. Woodrow Wilson had this film shown in the White House. And the film, it didn't have any black actors, of course. They just put blackface on white actors to play the role of the evil Black Scourge. This is what President Woodrow Wilson had to say. The white Housed by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a veritable empire of the South to protect the Southern country. That is the President of the United States. And he is speaking to a populace in America that's saying, we get it.
Wow.
When the terrorist shooting in Orlando happened, I was horrified by that carnage. And I thought, you know, I don't even have the adjectives to try and describe what people who were victimized there must have felt. But I have to tell you that I started getting angry when I heard them describe it as the largest mass terrorist shooting in American history. Now, if you hear news reports about it today, most of them have been modified. And what they say is it's the largest mass shooting by one person in American history. Because what came to mind for me were these. Can I see a show of hands? Who was taught about this?
I can't deal with all this goddamn noise, yo. This shit is crazy. Peace, guys.